Today is Wednesday. It is September the 1st, 2021. The title of today's devotional is Guiding Principles for Life and Friendships. Now, our scripture reading, Psalm 101, and Psalm 105. Now, the focus of this devotional will be Psalm 100. It's authored by David, and we will find it is a very practical study. Psalm 101, then, I have subtitled this devotional, A Resolution of Thanksgiving and Devotion. Now, imagine living under a ruler whose passion was not his career or his legacy, but foremost his love and gratitude for the Lord. Well, such were the golden years of David's reign in Jerusalem. The date and setting of the psalm is not known, but I believe it was in the early years of his reign as king over Israel. Now, the purpose and overriding theme of Psalm 101 is found in verse 1. It is a song of praise for the mercy and the judgment of the Lord. However, beginning in verse 2 and going through verse 8, you're going to notice assertions of the king concerning his personal life and choices. In fact, as you look at the verses, you're going to see there are 9 assertive I will statements and 6 shall statements. Allow me to walk you through this chapter. Psalm chapter 101 again, verse 2 and 3. David, in those verses, purposes to live a righteous life. David determined as a matter of conviction that he would act in and I quote, a perfect way, and that he would conduct his life with a perfect or an innocent heart. You see, the king had set for himself an intolerance for observing or tolerating a wicked thing in his eyes. Psalm 101 and verse 3. He was resolute, saying he would hate the sins he observed in others. Now, not hate the sinner, but hate the sins. But also guard his own heart and guard his own eyesight. Now, we know later in his life he failed miserably. And the shadow of that failure would follow him throughout the rest of his life. But think about it for a moment. How much would your life and your family change if you dedicated yourself to David's standard of personal holiness and righteousness? Will you set your heart to walk a higher moral road, even if it means walking alone? Remember, what you tolerate and the influences others have will inevitably affect your life choices. Now, verse 4 and 5, David adopted guiding principles and convictions. Here is where we find the I will and the I shall. Now, although this passage of Scripture was penned 3,000 years ago, 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, the guiding principles we observe in Psalm 101 should resonate in the heart of all believers. David's I will and I shall statements leave no room for ambiguity. David was a man of conviction, and as king there were always those who desired his favor and sought for power and position in his administration. David realized that those closest to him would influence him with their counsel and their character. Now, Psalm 101, then verses 4 and 5, and then verse 7, lists the manner of men the king would tolerate in his emissaries. In other words, with whom would he fellowship? Who would work with him? Who would serve beside him? Well, David lists the disqualifications for those men he would not have in his court. In verse 4, we find the description, a froward or a crooked or a deceitful heart, and a wicked person would not be allowed in the king's court. Also a slanderer, a gossip, someone that was also proud and self-indulgent. Those servants had no place in the king's household. And even verse 7, liars and deceivers were unwelcomed in the king's court. And so we've seen the disqualifications. If you desire to be in the king's court, here are the things that you must not have true about your life. But notice in verse 6 the spiritual qualifications for servants to the king. Psalm 101, then in verse 6, the psalm so far has focused on the qualities the king determined were undesirable and cause for disqualification. But in verse 6, we have two qualities that the king required of his servants. Number one, mine eye shall be upon the faithful of the land, that they may dwell with me. So the first qualification that David sought in a man that would serve in his court was that they were a testimony of faithfulness. Faithfulness to the Lord, faithfulness to his word, faithfulness to his law, faithfulness to his commandments, and faithfulness to their duties. The second, he that walketh in a perfect way, he shall serve me. Now the idea there of perfect is not that any man is perfect, but there is a longing and a desire to walk in a way that would honor the Lord. You see, the men David desired in his fellowship and company were faithful, tried, and true men of conviction. He required men that walketh in a perfect way to serve him and the people. Now, the word walketh is in the King James Bible, and it really does give an accurate insight into the character of those who serve the king. Walketh is an idea of a continuing procession or progress. Regardless of a man's talent, none would serve the king who fell short of a blameless testimony when measured by God's law and judgment. Now, here are some closing thoughts and an application. It was not enough for the king to declare the qualifications and disqualifications of those closest to him. Verse 8 is so enlightening because there we read that David was determined to not only disallow the wicked, he was determined to actively oppose them. Verse 8 we read, I will early destroy, the literal meaning there is I will silence all the wicked of the land, that I may cut off, I might exterminate all wicked doers from the city of the Lord. So it wasn't enough that he would say, I'm not going to tolerate the wicked. He says that I will actively oppose them. Now here's an invitation then. The guiding principles and convictions must be weighed and determined for our lives and family. I believe there are too many believers that go through life without ever setting their heart and their mind and even setting on paper those things that are their principles and convictions for their lives. If you and I follow David's pattern, we must establish and state our personal convictions as we find them in verse 3. Now I have a question for you as I close. Will you determine to live a life that is in keeping with a pure and innocent heart? You see, you and I have to decide the influences in our lives. The king determined he would not tolerate liars, gossips, proud, deceivers. In fact, he stated he would actively oppose them. But he also set a spiritual standard for his own life, for anyone that was closest to him. They were to be faithful to the Lord, faithful to his law, faithful to his commandments. Now I ask as I close, have you adopted guiding principles for your friendships? I encourage you to examine your personal convictions, I will and I shall, and the character of those closest to you. What manner of people are your friends? God bless.